Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So I'm back talking about the history and hauntings of the Old Alton Bridge, or Goatman's Bridge, in Denton County, Texas, very close to where I grew up. Most of the time, my series are fine to listen to out of order, though I will say for this episode, it's worth listening to the last episode, This Way to the Goatman, before listening to this one, just because they're really connected. They both deal with popular legends about what may have caused a haunting at the Old Alton Bridge. And they're urban legends that should be taken with a grain of salt, but both episodes also deal with the racist history that underpin both of these urban legends. So if you haven't listened to the last episode, it's worth listening to that one first and then coming back and listening to this one. And sorry about how the last episode was late and there were some technical glitches with it. I had some computer trouble, which led me to delay the episode by a week. And then there was an issue with my podcast hosting service, which I really need to switch, where it didn't post correctly. So as of today, June 13th, it should be appearing in your podcatcher. When this comes out, it should definitely be appearing in your podcatcher correctly. If for some reason it isn't, it's worth maybe unsubscribing to the podcast and resubscribing, and that should refresh the feed, and it should have the version of the episode with audio that you can actually play. So, sorry again about that. The tail end of this Mercury retrograde, and I guess Mercury retrograde shadow period, really wreaked havoc on that episode. So before I get into this episode, content note for this episode, same as last time, I'm going to be talking about white supremacist violence, chattel slavery, and racism. It's some pretty unpleasant stuff, but it is, I think, integral to understanding some of the stuff at work with the legends about this bridge. So last time I talked about the possibly apocryphal story of the murder of Oscar Washburn, a black man who was supposedly lynched by the Klan in the 1930s. I talked about how there is some doubt that this person ever existed, but there were many Oscar Washburns pretty much throughout the region's history. I talked about how the KKK were extremely active in Denton to the point of doing public parades, and they made a practice of kidnapping and murdering Black people with the tacit permission and, help of law enforcement, the cooperation of law enforcement, I guess you would say. Also, white supremacy led to the destruction of a thriving Black community called Quakerstown, which once was in Denton. That's helpful context to have in mind getting into today's episode, where we will go back in history to the 1860s and look at a period of Texas history that I had never heard of called the Texas Troubles, which tie directly into another famous legend about the haunting of the Old Alton Bridge, which is the story of the murder of Jack Kendall. So it's worth remembering that the Old Alton Bridge was built in the 1880s, so this story happens prior to the bridge's construction. So despite being from Texas and being from the Dallas area and having taken several years of Texas history in school, I have no memory of learning about the Texas Troubles. I had never heard of them before doing this research, and, Texas has been known to pretty heavily rewrite history textbooks, so it's possible that that might be why this somehow escaped my notice. There's a really great article in the Texas Observer from 2010 that I'm going to be drawing heavily from in this episode. You can find it at texasobserver.org/troubled-times, and I also have that link in the show notes. And this article has some really important context for when you're looking at the history of the area, and this article just in general is really well written and good, and it's really worth a read, but I wanted to read a bit from this article. Texas would like to forget it was a slave-holding state. The nation saw this spring as some members of the State Board of Education tried to erase the word slavery from several parts of the social studies curriculum. According to the still dominant narrative here, slavery was no big deal in Texas. As University of North Texas historian Randolph Campbell puts it, without slavery, Texas gets to be a Western state, one that joined the Confederacy for reasons of principle only. History that contradicts this narrative is conveniently forgotten. So that paragraph just really struck a chord with me because that is how I learned about Texas history in school. I definitely always had an impression that Texas was more like part of the West and not really part of the South. And I don't know, I was always a good student in history class, but as I was doing this research, I was like, maybe I wasn't. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. That's not the case. We definitely didn't learn about this. So the article goes on to talk about how, according to the census, by 1860, almost 200,000 enslaved people lived in Texas. That's 1/3 of the population. So, there's all this stuff trying to claim that Texas was not a large state for enslavement, but I mean, 1/3 of the population, that's just wild to me. In 1860, there was a major drought and a heat wave in a lot of the South, which didn't help the uneasy political atmosphere at the time. This was right before the Civil War, which started in 1861. Wells were drying up and crops were dying. It was just a bad scene. And when natural disaster strikes, people have a tendency to look for a scapegoat or someone to blame or someone to vent their frustration onto, right? So to continue reading a bit from this article, on July 8th, most of Dallas's 678 residents were sweating out their siestas indoors when a fire broke out at Walls Peak's drugstore downtown. The townspeople could do little but run outdoors as hot winds blew the flames from one dry wooden building to the next. By the time the fire burned out, half the town's business district was destroyed. Similar fires happened at almost the same time in Denton and the hamlet of Pilot Point. The excitable editor of the burned down Dallas Herald, Charles Pryor, sent letters to several newspapers about an alleged abolitionist plot afoot in Texas that aimed to burn the state down. The response was swift and inflammatory. There was a call to form vigilance committees, secretive bodies usually elected by the men of a town or county to bypass normal jurisprudence. "We will hang every man who does not live above suspicion," wrote J.W.S. of Fort Worth's Vigilance Committee to the New York Daybook in August 1860. "It is better for us to hang 99 innocent, suspicious men than to let one guilty one pass, for the guilty one endangers the peace of society." So, just let that sink in. It's completely evil, I would say, right? And it kind of goes against, if you're a fan of the US justice system, it kind of goes against all that stuff about innocent before proven guilty, et cetera, right? It's a call for vigilante justice that kills more innocent people than guilty and is fine with that. So night patrols formed, and the committee started deciding that some enslaved people seemed like suspects, as did potential abolitionists. So in addition to Black enslaved people, white people from the North, foreigners, and Mexican Americans were targets of these vigilante mobs, or vigilance committees. To read a bit more from the article, one man in Marshall wrote his father, "Every man that travels this country is taken up and examined, and if he does not give a good account of himself, he is strung up to the nearest tree." In Dallas on July 23rd, the Vigilance Committee met in the county courthouse. This is the Dallas County Courthouse, not the Denton County Courthouse, which I've mentioned in prior episodes. Some members wanted to hang all enslaved people in the entire county, but that idea was struck down because it would, quote, entail a great loss of property. So instead, they decided to target 3 enslaved Black men, Patrick Jennings, Sam Smith, and someone just called Old Cato. All 3 men were hanged the next day on the bank of the Trinity River. Because the river has since been rerouted, the exact riverbank doesn't exist anymore, but apparently Dealey Plaza is the closest place to that site. And if Dealey Plaza sounds familiar, it is because that's where JFK was assassinated. So there is a lot more to the story of the Texas Troubles. And again, if you want to know more, I'll refer you to the article I mentioned in the Texas Observer. But for example, it sounds like the fires may have been caused by faulty matches that may have ignited on their own in the really hot summer. It doesn't sound like that's confirmed, but it sounds like that's the best story folks have nowadays for why this happened, from what I could tell. And, it's just wild that what was probably an accident could have caused a panic that led to the deaths of many innocent people. I read on the Texas State Historical Association website that at least 30 people died in the Texas Troubles, but that the death count may have actually been closer to 100. Both black and white people were killed, and the impression that I get is that white Texans assumed that enslaved people didn't have the vision to do an insurrection on their own, so they assumed that white abolitionists were the brains behind this imaginary insurrection. So it's just wild to think that there was this panic that may have killed up to 100 innocent people. Also worth noting, Texas joined the Confederacy in February 1861, and historians seem to think that the Texas Troubles played a large part in radicalizing the white population of Texas, who only 2 years before had elected Sam Houston to be governor on a pro-union platform. I wanted to read a bit more of the Texas Observer article, kind of about this lack of knowledge about the event nowadays. So to read from that, if we've forgotten the Texas Troubles, we can first thank many of the participants themselves. One secessionist editor who published the evidence of an abolitionist plot later went on to write the first history of Dallas County. By then, in 1887, he could barely bring himself to mention the events of 1860. To write of that time, he said, quote, "would be to open a question, the discussion of which should be left to a later day. That day is still being put off. Randolph Campbell laughs at the thought of the state organizing any kind of public discussion or exhibition on the Texas Troubles 150 years later. It would be murderously difficult," he said. Campbell touches on the Troubles in his book, An Empire for Slavery. The book also matter-of-factly describes how, at the time, it was nothing odd for a Texan to hold the title Negro and Real Estate Broker, and how the least labor of slaves put young white heirs through college. So, this is an ugly chapter of Texas history that it has been buried as much as possible, much like the history I talked about in the last episode. And, like I said, growing up in Texas, I really feel like Texas's role in the Civil War was really downplayed, at least in history class. There was this real sense that Texas is not the South, and that it's kind of its own thing, but it's closer to the West. And, I moved away from Texas when I was 18, and I'm ashamed to admit this, but I honestly didn't think that much about all of this until 2019, which was when my wife and I got married. Our wedding was in Denton, right by Denton Square, about a block or two away from where the courthouse is. So after the wedding, we were taking pictures around the courthouse at Denton Square, and I remember noticing, for the first time, that there is a large Confederate statue there. I will say, when I went back in 2021, the statue was gone, thankfully. Turns out that was taken down in June 2020, and I will include a link to an article with more info about that in the show notes if you want to know more about that. But it's just baffling to me that this history seems to have been, I guess, sublimated to such an extent that we really only see it in our urban legends in Texas, at least until fairly recently. And there's a lot to be said about what functions urban legends have, and whether they're kind of like this place that we dump the things we don't want to think about, or maybe it's one of those things where it's like we want to forget something, or, some people want the populace to forget something, but just like when you try not to think about something, it pops up involuntarily. And, like a ghost, the area is haunted by its awful history. I don't know. I'm still thinking a lot about the function of urban legends, but I definitely, I think this is all twisted up together. This idea of these legends and this idea of this part of history that was buried, or that people tried to bury and hide. So anyway, what does all of this have to do with the old Alton Bridge? So like I said, it's tied in with an urban legend that is similar to the Oscar Washburn story that I told last week, though this one is a bit more sensational. So, last time I said take this with a grain of salt. Now I say take this with even more of a grain of salt, just because, well, you'll see. The story goes that in 1860, during the panic surrounding the Texas Troubles, some cowboys from nearby Copper Canyon murdered an enslaved Creole goat herder named Jack Kendall. They hanged him from a tall tree near the creek, right around where the old Alton Bridge is now. But these cowboys were incompetent. unsurprisingly, and supposedly they accidentally decapitated him in the process. It has been said that Kendall's headless body stood up and ripped off the head of a nearby goat to replace his own head, which was still on the noose. Okay. And since Kendall was Creole, the legend says that his body was reanimated via voodoo, and of course that claim seems like complete BS, and it sets off some racism alarm bells in my brain, but it is a thing that is said, and I am not saying that I think there's any paranormal truth to that. I think it sounds like a sensational thing that someone thought of. There's also a version of the story that says that Kendall came back as a zombie and ate his family, which also sounds incredibly made up. And it gets worse. I found a pretty screwed up, again, really made up sounding version of the Jack Kendall story that I will share, but with the caveat that it seems even less reliable than your typical unreliable urban legend. I'm really only repeating it in the interest of fully exploring the rumors about the topic. But I don't take this one seriously, even in the slightest. Kind of like how I don't take the other two ones I just talked about that seriously. Like, I think that it's possible that a enslaved Creole man may have been murdered by some cowboys, but that's about all I'm able to believe about this Jack Kendall story. So, on some not very reputable seeming websites, there's a story about a Jack Goatman Kendall who is not said to be black in this version. His race is not specified, so it seems like the tellers are assuming that he was white. Anyway, Kendall was supposedly a goat herder who smelled like goats because he spent so much time around them, and because he wore goat skin, and people around the area didn't like to be around him because of the smell. One version of the story said that the flock was made up of, quote, large black, orange, red, and green-eyed goats. And the punctuation in that sentence was abhorrent, adding to the lack of credibility that the story has. One version of the story says that the local townspeople avoided him, whereas another said that, quote, many of the merchants in Denton, Marshall, and Henderson, and as far as Galveston and also Shreveport, Louisiana, thought this old man to be very strange, and often he was the topic of conversation as far as New Orleans. One version said that he was having sex with goats, and that the goat man was the offspring of that. Another version says he was murdered by the townspeople because he was having sex with the goats and then came back and haunted them as the goat man. To be honest, these variations of this story sound like complete BS. And to me, I think it's probably creepypasta, which is a made-up internet urban legend. Those are very popular. Like I said, the punctuation and grammar on the accounts that I found is horrendous, and the fact that they're written in a way that is totally scattershot and imprecise also doesn't lend it much credibility. Plus, to add to the air of sensationalism and unreliability, one of the websites that I found the story on had a very 2002, maybe even late 90s, special effect of pixel art bugs crawling all over the screen. Then you have to hover your mouse over them to kill them so you can read the article. And then the bugs lay on the bottom of the screen on their backs with their legs twitching. I remember when that kind of thing was all over the internet, but it's been a while, so while the website is an interesting time capsule, I don't trust a word it says. However, I did want to mention some of the more obviously fake legends about the Bridges' paranormal origin story, so there you go. Again, I put some credence in the idea that there may have been a Creole man who was enslaved, who was murdered. That seems totally plausible, especially because we know that an unknown number of people, Black people and, white people who could be suspected of being abolitionists, were murdered in 1860. So it fits that historical fact. But beyond that, these other stories just sound like campfire stories and creepypasta. And from both a historical point of view and a paranormal point of view, I can't give them any kind of respect, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And again, maybe there's something to be said here about urban legends, right? Like you take a real thing like the Texas Troubles and you wrap it up in layers of obviously fake BS. And suddenly that real thing seems like maybe it was made up as well. But, the history of racism in the area is very real, and unfortunately, not all of the area's racism is in history. Some of it's still alive and kicking. So this next bit is pretty upsetting, but it felt like a story I should tell when talking about the history of racist violence in the area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the death of Lermont Stowers Jones. I'm not going to go really in depth into this next story because it is a recent death. It's really, really awful. I'm not interested in being a true crime podcast, and I'm really just mentioning this because I think it's relevant to the stories of racist violence at the bridge. So, in reading different urban legends about the Old Alton Bridge, there have been lots of claims of deaths at the bridge. But the only confirmed death I could find was the story of the death of Lermont Stowers Jones in 2018. And I found this set of news stories after I'd been Googling and reading about the area for a while, looking for stories of any murders or deaths or anything. And this one felt kind of buried. I did a lot of newspaper searches, etc. So while this story is not connected to tales of hauntings, and as I've mentioned in past episodes, I think it is in terrible taste to try to insinuate hauntings into recent deaths, this story is tied to the bridge's racist history, or the history of racism around the bridge, so that's why I'm talking about it. And I guess I should give a caveat here that everything I'm about to say here is alleged. I'm just repeating what I have read online. This is a really awful story, like I said, and this death didn't show up on a lot of the newspaper searches that I did looking for deaths in the area, I think because it was probably just too recent. But on November 20th, 2018, a 17-year-old kid named Lermont Stowers Jones, whose nickname was Mont, was found dead in Hickory Creek. His family described him as compassionate and charismatic. He enjoyed playing the keyboard, and he often performed at the church where his family went, Pleasant Grove Baptist Church. He was on the AB honor roll at Denton High School, and he planned to go to college and to go into criminal justice. I'm going to call Lermont Stowers Jones Mont from here on out, since I'll be talking about other people with the same last name, and when I was trying to write this script using people's last names, it was getting really confusing. So that's why I'm deviating from my usual style. So on November 19th, 2018, someone had called 911 and said that Mont jumped from the Old Alton Bridge into the creek and did not resurface. The initial impression was that this was maybe a tale of teenage hijinks gone wrong, but there's a lot of strange, suspicious stuff about this story, and his family have told reporters that they believe his death was not an accident. So what's some of the strange stuff around this story? So for example, the Denton Police Department wasn't dispatched to the scene or involved in the investigation. That's because technically the Old Alton Bridge is on county land. So instead, the Denton County Game Wardens conducted the investigation, which just seems bizarre to me. I tried to do some Googling to see whether game wardens usually handle cases of suspicious deaths. I mean, you wouldn't think so. It is very strange that a game warden might be or a set of game wardens might be the ones investigating a death. I couldn't find much information either way, but I didn't see anything to suggest that they might be, forensic experts or the people you would want to investigate a suspicious death. So even before doing a lot of digging into this, just reading the basic stories about this in the Denton Record Chronicle, I thought it was weird. It felt like something was off. We're talking about the Old Alton Bridge, a place where tons of teenagers have partied in the past, but where, as far as I could find, only this one teenager in recent history had died. It was odd to me that this didn't seem more notable or even suspicious to anyone investigating. There is an article on a website called livingbluetexas.com, which goes into a lot of detail about the story, so I'll include a link to that in the show notes. So if you want to know a lot more detail, read that. But if what the article says is true, then it certainly sounds like there is some credibility in his family's claim that he was murdered and that there was no investigation into the murder. An article in the Dentonite fleshes out the story a little bit more. So the reporter interviewed Mont's parents, Lerman Jones and Amy Stowers Jones, in April 2019, about 4 or 5 months after his death. Both of them expressed distress with the story that they were told, which was that he had died after jumping off the bridge. For example, Mont's mother said, Lermont wouldn't have jumped off a bridge. He was scared of heights. He wouldn't even ride the rides at Six Flags. I know my son wouldn't have jumped in muddy water because we go fishing a lot. He wouldn't even stick his feet in water just to go out there and get the hook a couple feet down. So yeah, doesn't sound like someone who's going to do a daredevil jump off a bridge. They also said that they saw discrepancies with the accounts that they heard from the police and witnesses, and they weren't the only ones with concerns. Mont's cousin, Angela James, who had been acting as spokesperson for the family, said that the time of the 911 call didn't quite coincide with the timelines the witnesses described. Mont's father said that he heard someone use a racial slur in the background of the 911 call. So he said, I have heard that 911 call. Get that N-word, is what they said. So it sounds like there had been a dispute between Mont and one of his classmates at Denton High School, which might have come into play here. So Angela James said there were threats. They made reports to the police station. They made contact with the school. Someone told him they were going to harm him. The article on Living Blue, Texas goes into way more detail on this, but for example, a white student had recently been expelled for saying he was going to bring a gun to school and kill Lermont Stowers Jones. According to a 2021 article in the Dallas Observer, for the weeks leading up to his death, Mont had experienced daily racial harassment and death threats, which he had reported to the police and to the high school. Also, the family thought that the location of their son's death was suspicious, since the Old Alton Bridge is famous for being the site of a lynching, maybe 2 lynchings. Mont's father said, I Googled it and that's when I found the history. It sounds a little too coincidental. The family also said that the police made some screwed up assumptions about Mont's behavior, so the cops initially said that they had suspected that he had been using heroin, but of course a toxicology report disproved that. Supposedly traces of weed were in his system, but the toxicology report labeled that as unverified. Also, according to that Dallas Observer article, after his death, the sheriff's department started parking their vehicles across the street from the family's home, which the family took as a threat. So after that, the family had to move and install security systems and cameras because they were so afraid. Now, maybe you're wondering why a black family might feel unsafe because the sheriff's department has people hanging out around their house. You probably don't actually wonder that if you listen to the last week's episode, but, last week I went into a lot of detail about the historical connections between law enforcement and the KKK and how they collaborated in murdering innocent black people. So I want to return to one of the sources that I used extensively last week, a paper by a UNT student called In the Tall Grass West of Town, Racial Violence in Denton County During the Rise of the Second Ku Klux Klan by Micah Carlson Crittenden. Per Crittenden's paper, on October 17, 2006, the Counterterrorism Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation released an unclassified intelligence assessment on the infiltration of local law enforcement by white supremacist groups. Therein, they warn that work to counter white supremacy cannot reliably be conducted by local law enforcement because many police forces have been infiltrated by white supremacist groups and ideology. This highlights the importance of an open examination of racial violence, unencumbered by use of a rope. With a clearly established relationship between the Ku Klux Klan and the Denton County Sheriff's Department in the 1920s, this work asks a question of our present. What has structurally changed in the oversight of law enforcement since 1920? So again, this is from an FBI report. So there's obviously a lot more I could say about racial violence and law enforcement that I think probably everybody already knows about, right? But beyond the obvious stuff that's happening today and that is in the public sphere a lot, with Black Lives Matter, etc. I mean, I'm no fan of the FBI, but even the FBI, who are famous for notoriously racist programs of surveillance like COINTELPRO in the mid-20th century, etc., even the FBI has concerns about this. So it's not like this is some sort of fringe belief or conspiracy theory or anything like that, right? So the Dentonite article closes with a quote from Mont's mother. "I know for a fact my son was murdered. I feel like the city just completely failed us." So according to the article, they planned to hire a lawyer once the cops filed a final report on the case, but as far as I could tell, I don't think that much has happened on that front since his death. This is a really awful case, and it seems suspicious as hell to me, based on everything I have read. And like I said, if you want to know more, you can read the Dallas Observer, Dentonite, and Living Blue Texas articles about his death, which I will include in the show notes. Also, there are a couple websites that have donation links to try to raise money to help Mont's family fight for justice for him, but it looks like they are currently inactive. I'm not totally clear on whether there's anything that you can do to support the family right now, but if I find out anything, I'll update the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com with that info. So, at any rate, in conclusion, I think this really underscores the location's ties to racism and anti-Black violence, both in the past and to this day. And there's an interesting question tied up in all of this, which is, how do urban legends affect us today? Like yeah, they're told by teenagers to scare each other. They, maybe contain some hidden aspects of our past that we don't want to talk or think about, or that other people don't want folks to talk or think about. But if, as Mont's family alleges, this was a case of a racially motivated murder, and if the potential murderer chose that spot because of its significance and because of its history of racism, that's kind of an instance of, I don't know, like an urban legend reaching back out and hurting someone. And, just on a hypothetical level, I think that if someone is motivated to murder someone, they would do it no matter whether an area had a history of that sort of violence or not. Like, if there was nowhere with that sort of history, there's other places a person could choose to murder someone that just maybe doesn't have that sort of resonance. But, if a murder occurred and if this site was selected because of the urban legend, then I don't know. That's just really chilling and is certainly food for thought when thinking about urban legends and whether they're harmless, etc. So I know the last 2 weeks have been a pretty rough look at the area's history, though, I do think it's completely essential to looking at the legends that have cropped up in this area. From here on out, I do think this series is going to get a little bit more, let's say, lighthearted. I'm going to be diving much more into the paranormal aspects of the bridge. I've gone through many reports of weirdness at the bridge. And next week, I'm going to talk about the Goatman. Kind of what are some famous legends about Goatmen around the country, around Texas, and then, of course, like legends of the old Alton Bridge, Goatman. Like, let's look at this figure almost, as a cryptid, basically. So that's next week. Keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, you can check out the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can follow me on Instagram at buriedsecretspodcast. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please rate and review. Please tell your friends about it. And thanks so much for listening.